Welcome back. This is our 7th episode, and we have another great interview lined up for you. But before we get into it, we have some announcements to make. First, the New Political Economy of Europe podcast is now on TuneIn. You can download the app and listen to us from there. And you can also check the link in our SoundCloud page if you want to use it. We're planning to branch out to other audio platforms, including Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube, possibly with some video support. This is all thanks to Andrew Fogarty from UCD. He is putting a really big effort into making this podcast cooler and more professional, so big thanks to him. Okay, today we have Aidan Regan talking with Pepper Culpepper, who also came to present in our seminar series. Pepper is the Blavatnik Chair in Government and Public Policy at Oxford University. His research focuses on the intersection between capitalism and democracy, and he is the author of the book Quiet Politics and Business Power, Corporate Control in Europe and Japan, which was awarded the 2012 Stein-Rokan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. Pepper is currently involved in the Banklash project, which examines changing attitudes towards banks in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. In this episode, he and Aidan talk about quiet politics, the differences between and intersections of instrumental and structural forms of power, the conditions under which the economic interests of organized business lose to other voters in contemporary democracies, and the EU's response to the 2008 economic crisis. If you want additional information, as always, you can find it in our SoundCloud page or our own main webpage, or the Twitter account where you can follow us for regular updates. Enjoy!
Well, welcome to UCD, Pepper. It's great to have you here. It's great to see you again. For our listeners, Pepper was my mentor at the European University Institute in Florence, so we go back a few years, and I've learned a lot from Pepper over the years. And your presentation today on media and Banklash is fascinating. We'll talk about that shortly. But we might go back a bit in time and talk about your book on quiet politics and business power. What does quiet politics mean?
So, quiet politics was about a disjuncture that I was having between what I was seeing in politics, in the areas that I was studying in the political economy, and what my colleagues thought was happening. And that my colleagues had this sort of occupational disability of being political scientists, like I am. And so therefore they imagined that there was a world where parties were competing for the median voter, and that was who managed to put together the biggest coalition to get the median voter within that coalition managed to win, both in the interest group terrain and in the electoral terrain. But the kind of electoral terrain dominated the way people were thinking about this. And I was off studying, I'd spent some time studying vocational training and the role of employers in that, and I found they were quite dominant. And then I had moved into institutions of corporate governance and finance, and they were quite dominant there. And I realized they were winning distributional battles without ever having to fight them. And so quiet politics was this sort of recognition of what most people who just observe politics and don't have the misfortune to study it for a living, as I do, know, which is that essentially by having politics happen in a quiet environment, business has the deck loaded in its favor. And I don't mean this in any nefarious way. It's that people generally want the experts there, and businesses know a lot about their own businesses, and they know about what it's about to meet payroll, and so they're called disproportionately to provide representatives to be on committees. And so if you have committees that are happening in a quiet forum outside of the public spotlight on something that doesn't catch the public eye, then you have a quiet debate among experts, but in which the composition of the committee is slanted systematically, I find, in favor of business. And so that became what's quiet about quiet politics. And so, of course, the contrast to quiet politics is with noisy politics, which is when people are protesting outside. And when people are protesting outside, then quite a different thing happens where business is not just allowed to represent and say this is what's good for growth, but instead other voices get brought to the table, and this sort of representation of a broader set of voices at the table tends, on average, not to be exactly as conducive to business.
So quiet politics, in a sense, is the way that business exercises its power, whether intentionally or not. And is it the case that within quiet politics, let's say it's about executive pay, financial regulation, arguably the engine of investment decisions that take place within contemporary capitalist economies, is it the case that business know that it's better to keep their decisions quiet and therefore they pursue particular strategies to maintain a quiet fora? Or is it just a byproduct of the way, well, the economy works?
So I think that varies a little bit, but I think as a broad generalization, business actors suspect that the quieter things are, the better for them. And I rush again to say that I don't mean this in some sort of nefarious way where things are happening in order to keep the public out, but business knows that if it turns itself into a technocratic conversation where its experts are disproportionately represented, it's likely to do better. And I think a large majority of business leaders know that. I've written an article recently with Kathy Thielen on platform power that talks about how platform companies like Uber, like Amazon, they're quite happy to sort of take their debate to the public because they think the public is largely behind them. And I don't think most businesses think most of the time that if you just put what they're delivering to the public on the table, the public will be behind them. And so I think that these platform companies are different because they are willing to go and fight in public fora because they think they can win in those fora, though they haven't always found it to be true, and they may find a renewed interest in quiet politics given some of the recent occurrences.
So you've also written a lot about the difference between instrumental and structural power. Maybe explain that difference to our listeners.
So the difference between instrumental and structural power far precedes me, and very smart people have been writing about it for a long time. But essentially, it was a debate in Marxism about that emerged in sort of Marxist sociology and social science in the 1960s. That pitted people like Ralph Miliband on the one hand, the father of the Miliband brothers, who are no longer in British politics, in British politics, but very much on the sideline, and Nikos Poulantzas on the other. And sort of Miliband was saying that it was what came to be called the instrumental power of business that was so important. That's to say, all its connections, the sort of things that I write about in Quiet Politics, where because states are run by politicians who went to school with people who are in business. Everyone thinks like a business person, and business has easier access to get what it wants. And so that's kind of an instrumental view that lobbying, it makes business powerful because lobbying business groups have lots of money. Structural power was that the entire state, whether or not it's listening to business, is geared so as to live off the back of capitalist production. And so therefore, even if business is not particularly influential in the halls of lobbying and the state is ignoring business, keeping it at a distance, people operating in politics have an interest in running the state in a way that is favorable to business. So the very power of the state depends on business doing well. And that gives business a structural power where it doesn't have to do anything. And my favorite, and many people's favorite evocation of this, is what Charles Lindblom called the punishing recoil mechanism, where if you make a decision against business, businesses don't have to do any lobbying, they just stop investing. Jobs go down, and boink, the punishing recoil mechanism hits somebody in the face who finds themselves in an electoral challenge. And so that's the structural power. And quiet politics is not so much about structural power, it's about lobbying. And so I became interested in thinking more about structural power when I moved into finance, where I think the role of finance in the economy sometimes exercises strong structural power.
So in a special issue, I think, that you edited in Business and Politics on this relationship between instrumental and structural power and why we need to bring these debates back into political science, I think you made a very interesting point about we need to think about the relationship between instrumental and structural power as it pertains to business and state, that ultimately what happens, structural power is a mutual set of dependencies that exists between business and state. So on the one hand, even with finance, banks are dependent upon the state to regulate and to legislate for certain policies that are within their interest. So it's not like you can have one without the other. And I think that's an interesting observation, because often when we think about structural power, it can lead to the observation that, well, there's nothing we can do. Business runs the show, and business has the threat of capital flight, and therefore we ought to reduce capital income corporate tax to 0% effectively because they're going to move around anyway. So we basically have to do what they want. But that underestimates the extent to which business depends upon government.
That's right, because business makes its money in markets, and if it makes a lot of its money in one market, then that leads to a certain dependency on the state, right? This is something that Marxist scholars wouldn't tend to emphasize as much, but it tends to be something that can be quite important. And so the whole point of that special issue, which has been one part of a flowering of things going on in structural power. I'm going to a conference in structural power that's being run by a bunch of exciting scholars next month in London at the LSE. So there's a lot of things flowering in people who work on how finance is being regulated in a variety of markets. That's finding the structural power way of doing analysis very intriguing. But it's exactly because it's not this old-fashioned idea that I think is wrong, that business wins all the time, but that there is this mutual set of dependencies, and we can understand a lot by understanding what business gets from the state and therefore how it becomes dependent on the state and vice versa.
So under what conditions does business lose?
Well, business loses in a couple of different situations. Most obviously, business loses in democracies when people mobilize en masse against business and demand different policy from governments. So this has long been the holy grail of understanding how public opinion can make for responsive politics, how you get people involved when their interests are at stake but they don't necessarily know it, how you can activate latent opinion, as one of my colleagues likes to call it. And that's something that I sort of begin to explore in A Quiet Politics, how you raise the salience of certain issues that are actually quite important, that as long as people aren't paying attention and considering them important and considering voting on this basis, well, politicians have little reason to pay attention to public opinion. So that, I think, is the biggest place where business does lose. And business loses even if the public is not massively mobilizing against it, when it's facing other strong interest group allies, because there are other interest groups, and of course, other interest groups are always trying to bring the public in to create what Gunnar Trumbull calls, legitimacy narratives that bring a lot of other interest groups along even if they don't grab public opinion, and they allow for a coalition to win against something that might favor business. And of course, business loses when it's divided. Business is often divided. Business isn't always on the same side. And so when business is divided, that's a situation where you'll get businesses pushing different positions. And so business, by definition, can't win if business is divided.
So in terms of the first one, the media, you think, plays an important role. If the media is making an issue salient, getting people talking about it, pushing an issue from quiet to noisy politics, it can open up the debate for potential contestation.
So I don't think the locution media makes something salient is not one I would use, because I would say instead that the media, where there are competing sources of media, they are constantly trying to speak to what the public wants and to get more clicks, to sell more newspapers in old-fashioned language. And doing that requires speaking to what people want to hear, and that's figuring out what they think is salient and trying to sell it to you, or figuring out something that they think would be salient if the people knew about it. And that's what investigative journalism, I think, often does so importantly. So media is really a relay mechanism between politics and public opinion. And it's the crucial mechanism by which people find out about what's going on in Washington, in London, in Brussels. And it's also where people in Washington and London and Brussels figure out what people care about, because they figure out what the newspapers are talking about, what the TV programs are covering, and they respond to that sort of pressure. And so it's figuring out that relay of information that I think is the important challenge in understanding how public opinion gets brought into politics.
So do you think the media shapes public opinion, or the media just responds to public opinion?
So that's a great question on which there's a lot of research, and there are few solid answers. One of the things I'm doing in this project I'm currently working on is trying to explore that, both by looking at how media coverage changes over time in different countries, in this particular subject for looking at financial regulation, and seeing how that is related to the policy change that you get and where public opinion stands on issues, and trying to think about how much there is a reservoir of outrage that can be drawn on. If you're looking at the financial crisis as a moment of great outrage in which many people in many countries felt like financial institutions in particular got bailed out and many other people like homeowners didn't get bailed out, that's created the perception of an unfair deal that has proved to be a kind of paying device for politicians on both the left and the right who are able to exploit it. So that's something that has brought anti-bank fervor into politics in a big way. And so your question is, well, does the media influence that or do they just reflect that? I think the media, the hypothesis guiding the work is that the way the media talks about politics is with a way that's trying to capture something that will speak to public opinion in a given country, but that over time reinforces certain tropes, certain narratives, and makes them dominant narratives. And though the dominance of those narratives eases the extent to which they can be recalled by new scandals and drawn on to get people re-engaged in politics. Because if people aren't re-engaged in politics because finance is boring, then they lose interest and go on to other things like understanding what's going on with celebrities. So the role of the media there is that it creates certain ways of talking about politics that can be drawn on, reused, and that can re-energize people's attention.
So I was in the States quite recently, and I always find it interesting when I'm in the States and I turn on the TV in the hotel, and I flick onto Fox News or I flick onto CNN, and they're both talking about the very same issue, but they're just framed in completely different ways. So I often wonder, is it the case that people are just self-selecting? If I'm a Republican, I'm just going to watch Fox News, or if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to watch CNN. Is there any research to suggest that it works the other way around, that people actually may change their views based on the media they consume?
Well, there's a nice piece recently that came out in the APSR called Persuading the Enemy, in which several scholars have looked at this question of if you force some people to choose media and you give others the choice, you can figure out what is the persuasive effect of something that you feed to someone who would have chosen Fox News if they're forced to sort of consume a piece of MSNBC. And that suggests that there can indeed be a persuasive effect. Now, of course, the problem with all these framing studies, including ones that I'm doing, is, how does what happens, when people are doing these internet surveys, how does it affect what happens in sort of the real world of news consumption? Well, it suggests that people are open to being persuaded. Jamie Druckman, among many others, but I would say he kind of has been leading in this field, has shown that strong frames can win over partisan pre-commitments, strong frames being ones that are resonant and available. If you are not in a highly polarized environment, the more you get in a highly polarized environment, the less people are willing to reflect on whether they might be wrong, whether they might want to change their views. Because the more you get into a polarized environment, the more you think about what some people call effective polarization, and where it's just all about my feelings and my tribe. And so even if I don't buy the argument of my tribe, I try to sell it anyway. So the US is certainly a place that's moving towards greater polarization. And it's an open question, which we will see again tested in 2020, the extent to which people can be moved, how much there is a sort of movable center, and how much there are just these extremes that have to be mobilized.
So you presented very interesting research today in our seminar at the UCD School of Politics and with the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence on your Banklash project. It's a great title. You might tell our listeners some of the findings so far from that project that you presented today.
Well, so Banklash is a project that's funded by the European Research Council to look at understanding the different elements of how people have reacted to 2008 and the financial crisis and how banks have come to be perceived in politics. And one big part of the project is about understanding what the media looks like and how we see the media framing politics differently in different countries. And one part of it is about the policy change that you get, the strategies of implementation that are followed after big policies are adopted over time, how much attrition do you get, if you like, in the extent to which regulation demands things out of bankers under different levels of public scrutiny. And then the third part, which is what I presented a little bit on today, some really preliminary pilot results, is about the sort of stories that that get people to change their minds on financial regulation. And this is very early days, and I wouldn't want to make any sweeping conclusions, but a hypothesis we're following that has some indicative evidence in what we've looked at so far is that telling a story about scandals, financial scandals, in the context of the way that an analysis of how the interests of ordinary citizens may not be congruent with those of the banks is much more persuasive in changing minds than a sob story about the travails that a particular family or individual has had at the hands of a rapacious bank. And there are unfortunately many stories like that you can draw on, and they get drawn on in many different countries to tell stories about banking. But telling a story about banking like that that's about individual suffering and unfairness makes readers really angry, but it tends not to change their financial regulation preferences, nor does it really change their perception of the difference in interests between banks and the public, or their trust in banks. It just makes them angry. And so anger in the absence of interest change doesn't seem to do very much.
But if you present it as a scandal, there is more of a probability that people will say, okay, something has to be done about this, as opposed to feeling just morally outraged about it.
Well, so if we present the scandal in the context of talking at how that scandal has sort of structural ramifications, that is to say, providing an interpretive lens for the scandal, that's where we find that it makes a difference, even if we don't talk about any people at all. So we know from the work of Chantal Ingard that if you generally talk about a subject in a thematic way, you might, which is to say, a sort of the structural contextual way, you might be giving them better information, but you're less likely to attract their interest. And so we're finding that if you tell structural stories, contextual stories, and you link it to an interest analysis, that's more effective than what Ingard calls the episodic stories, which is also what Ingard finds in getting people to sort of change their minds, change their ideas about policy.
And in the context of Europe, I mean, we'll take a step back. International financial crises, the Eurozone crises, sovereign debt crises, ultimately a banking crisis, and the EU response to that banking crisis, I think most people would agree, hasn't been great. Not a whole lot has been done. Is one of the reasons why the EU has not responded to the banking crisis and developed new laws and legislations precisely because people are not talking about it, that there's no European demos, or is it something else?
Well, so some people would answer that question by saying, well, things move very slowly in the European Union, so it's the mother of all deliberative processes, and you do see a sort of expression from Germany of a renewed interest in thinking about having deposit insurance at a Europe-wide level, which is certainly a change in position from what Germany has said in the past. But there's another story that is banks have played the game of sort of allowing individual governments to legislate, knowing they were going to legislate, and pushing the EU not to do anything. And so this is the story of the Lagarde structural reforms, which sort of died of lack of salience, if I may use sort of that term, because they pushed forward other measures about banking union, and then the banking union measures became much more talked about, and Lagarde structural reform kind of died. So right now, banking union is a very incomplete project. I've written an article arguing that it's a project with a colleague, that it's a project that's very much driven by the interests of large banks, and that in that sense, sort of what Europe has from banking union is something that's very conducive to the growth of its big internationally world-beating banks. And so I think that's where we are in Europe. It's hard to say where we'll go, but without public scrutiny, I think that's the system we're likely to stick with.
Because that's somewhat counterintuitive in the sense that most people would agree that too big to fail banks were at the source of the international crisis, and therefore the policy response might have been to avoid a situation where banks get too big to fail, which effectively means that they're socializing their losses. But the policy response by the EU has effectively to generate the conditions for more international too big to fail banks. How did we get there?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not so sure it's counterintuitive if you started out with the position that the banks were always likely to win. And so I think what we've seen is kind of incomplete pushback in different countries against too big to fail banks. Too big to fail banks have marshaled the argument, very large banks have marshaled the argument that in fact they're really good for the economy because they diversify risk within themselves. And they've had varying levels of success across countries. And so the understanding the sort of varying levels of success is one of the projects that Banklash is trying to undertake, because I'm not sure we entirely know. I would argue that in certain countries, it's likely that a few resonant ways of thinking about bankers and what banks have done have led to some structural reform that has had an impact, even if it's not the sort of world-changing structural reform that would have broken down too big to fail banks.
So how would you assess the EU's response to the financial crises and the type of post-crises regulations that have been introduced?
I would assess them as slow, incomplete, and unsatisfying.
Yeah. And do you think that's likely to change, or is it basically dependent upon a shift in national preferences amongst member states?
Well, assuming that current politics goes along the lines that it looks like it's going to, the EU is about to go through a big change with losing the United Kingdom. And I think that the direction of travel in the EU is very hard to say as a result of that. On the one hand, I think that the EU has been able to put off a certain number of crises that it had internally in its system because of the Brexit situation. And that it will have to confront those crises. And it may just be that a couple of existential crises confront Europe soon. Another more potentially positive scenario, especially for Euro-federalists, is the idea that the loss of the UK will give an impulsion to a positive push towards more integration. And certainly that's what Emmanuel Macron would like to see. And in that case, banking union could be one vessel for that greater integration.
And do you think anything will change with Christine Lagarde as head of the European Central Bank? Or is it just going to be business as usual?
I think that the European Central Bank has been one of the actors over the course of the last 10 years that has distinguished itself by the exceptional performance that Mario Draghi has given us. Now, I have colleagues who write about the sort of problems of quantitative easing and what that's doing to distort various parts of the market, and that may well be true. But the ECB that we've had has kept things from getting to a lot worse situation. So I wish Christine Lagarde good luck. I'm not really sure what we should expect from her regime, and I wouldn't expect dramatic change. I think it's interesting that we're moving away from having a trained economist as head of the bank. And I think it'll be very interesting to watch what that direction presages for other central banks, or whether it's portrayed as if something were to go wrong and the ECB be blamed for it, it would be interesting to see if economists say, well, see, I told you so, you got to put one of us in charge.
And we might just finish up on this last question comment, which is, again, related to the central bank and financial market regulation. I mean, it's often said, particularly within our field of political science, political economy, central banks are independent from government. And there's a whole variety of reasons why government delegate monetary policy to independent technical decision makers in the central bank. But it seems to me that one of the questions that needs to be asked in the aftermath of the crises is, to what extent are central banks independent from the financial market?
That's a really good question, and it's not one on which I've done a lot of work. So Desmond King and Larry Jacobs have written a really interesting book on this, where they essentially say that the Federal Reserve has found itself very much as a tool of finance, and its policy choices, which the Fed always portrays as sort of impartial choices to keep the economy going given sluggish demand, are represented by King and Jacobs as being things that benefit players in the financial markets. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done by political scientists on this. I don't agree with King and Jacobs on every point, but I think it's a huge area of spending that is happening somewhat below the radar. And so if you like, what central banks are doing is the quiet politics of the future. And so we need to put more attention on it.
Okay, Pepper. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Aidan, really a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.